Good afternoon. This is the second lesson in Chapter 3. Today we're going to build off what we did in the last lesson. Last lesson was about what are biotic and abiotic factors. And now we're going to describe how these things can be limiting on an organism's distribution and range. In other words, what kind of factors limit where an organism can live and how many of them can live there. Now at the very beginning, I put some examples here of things that are very typical limiting factors. And you'll see that these are a bunch of biotic and abiotic factors that we listed or saw in our class yesterday. Water availability, temperature, food, disease, predators. Some of them are biotic and some of them are abiotic. So for example, water availability, abiotic. Temperature, abiotic. The other three would all tend to be biotic factors since food is a biotic thing. Disease is usually caused by a biotic factor, and predators are definitely biotic. If I were to increase these factors or decrease, so I can increase or decrease these factors, and this will restrict the range and distribution of populations. Organisms can only exist in what's called the range of tolerance to the resources that support them. So I have two little graphs that I'd like to talk about. The one on the left is showing some actual organisms with an actual factor. So on the left, I have temperature along the bottom and growth along the left. So essentially we're talking about how fast do these different types of fish grow depending on what the temperature is. And you'll see that depending on the type, rainbow trout, yellow perch, largemouth bass, the optimum temperature for growth is different. Some of them require warmer temperatures, others require cooler temperatures for growth. Now on the right, we'll see some words that we can use to describe what's happening on the graph on the left. When we are at the peak, so that would be this spot right here. This is when organisms are abundant. Many organisms are capable of existing and existing happily and of growing well in this particular condition. This is called the optimum tolerance range. So it's the part of the graph where we're at the top. Everything is hunky-dory. Organisms are happy. Now that part of the graph would extend really in this whole top part for all of those fish. So what we're saying is for the rainbow trout, anywhere between 0 and let's say just about 20, probably 18 degrees, is optimum for growth. For the yellow perch, it's a little bit different. We're going to say optimum is, around 10 to about 30. And for the largemouth bass, maybe we'll say 25 to essentially 40. Now that's the optimum range, the part where the graph is having its peak. It's the bell part of this bell-shaped curve. Now when we get to the outside, we're going to enter this area here on the side. The line is quite low, but it's not non-existent. The idea here is that there are a few organisms. Some of them can tolerate this condition. So you'll notice we have the upper and the lower limit of tolerance. This is the upper limit. This is the lower limit. After that point, the line stops. There's no more organisms. So let's see for these guys, the rest of the line would represent this area where organisms are few. This is called the stress zone. It means that most organisms can't survive there. Some can, however. Lastly, we have this part over here. And I'm putting little dotted lines because there's no graph for me to highlight. This is where organisms are absent. I don't even have a graph to talk about because no organisms can exist in that condition. This is called intolerance. Whatever the limiting factor is, when it has gotten that high or that low, the organism cannot tolerate it anymore. So what we're saying is that, let's say for a rainbow trout, this whole section, because it's past where the line goes, and anything less than 0 would all be its zone of intolerance. The growth rate is 0 at that point. We don't have any of that particular type of fish. So the word optimum, stress, and intolerance are very general words we can use to describe how a factor is limiting or perhaps not limiting a population's growth. So I'll highlight some biotic limiting factors. Competition would be one. So if I take a look at trout, they are competing mainly for food, also for reproduction. And so when there are many of a similar type of organism, the limiting factor, the main biotic limiting factor could be competition. Now it could be that you're not so much worried about competition because there's not many like you, but you are worried about predators. So if I am an organism that lives in the Arctic, I might be concerned about an Arctic fox. That is a pretty slick predator. A limiting factor for a lot of organisms could be a parasite. So you'll notice over here, I have a flea, a leech, a tick, and a louse. They're all different types of parasites. A parasite requires a host. So that means they are going to negatively affect their host by causing some sort of difficulty for the host to obtain their food. For example, leeches are going to try to suck your blood out. That's not very convenient for you, but it's great for the leech. So the parasite is actually getting a benefit while you are being limited by those particular things. Climate and biomes are limiting factors. Climate in particular, where we're talking about average temperature and rainfall. Now, if you remember learning in Science 10, you would have discussed biomes that exist: tropical forest, tundra, taiga. I don't need you to give me a lot of specific details about different biomes that exist, but to recognize that they have distinctive average weather conditions. That's what climate is. Climate is average. If I were to talk about weather, I'm talking about today, right now. But climate means the average. Since places have average conditions, this determines which ecosystems can exist in certain areas. And so I put a little map over here to help illustrate how throughout the major continents, how biomes are distributed. And you can see on the map of North America, obviously, the northern part of North America is all the tundra biome. And the farther we go down, the more we get into biomes like forests and deserts. Now over here, you might have seen this graph before if you had Science 10 with me, because it's the one that I like to show. This graph illustrates how precipitation and temperature are sort of laid out across the biomes. Now we mentioned before that places that have a lot of precipitation and a lot of heat tend to have higher productivity, for sure. And generally, heat and moisture are good for organisms. Organisms tend to thrive on that. Granted, not every organism requires that, but for a lot of organisms, precipitation and temperature, so having warmth, are good things. And so the lack of them would be a limiting factor. So this is where we have lots of precipitation, and this is where we have little. So the closer we get to the part with little precipitation, the more limiting it becomes. When we're talking about temperature, it's actually cold up at the top and hot at the bottom. So the closer we get to cold, the more limiting it usually becomes. Now, if we talk about other abiotic factors besides something that has to do with climate, we could be talking about soil type, or the moisture or humidity available in the soil, and temperature range. So not necessarily what temperature is it right now, but where does the temperature change throughout the year. I'll give you an example of how abiotic factors affect something here in our province. There are trees called cottonwood trees. And what happens is that they grow on the banks of rivers. Changes to the river flow will determine whether or not there is flooding on the banks, and thus whether or not there is water available to the trees. So that's an abiotic factor. The level of the river determines whether or not water gets onto the bank, and that determines whether or not cottonwood trees can grow. Now, limiting factors limit an organism's distribution and range, and so we better talk about what range is and how that's different from habitat. A habitat is simply a set of abiotic and biotic conditions. A range is a geographical area where you would find those conditions. So I like to say that a range is on a map, whereas a habitat is just a description. It's like a bunch of adjectives. So I have an example here to illustrate the difference between the two. If I were to talk about snow leopards inhabit the mountainous regions and alpine meadows of China, India, Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, Mongolia, Nepal, Pakistan, Russia, and Tajikistan. That's its range because I'm showing you on a map all of the countries and places that it lives in. Now, when we talk about habitat, we are talking about where exactly or what condition exactly are they looking for. And so you'll notice that I am specifying altitude. In the summertime, high altitude, but in the wintertime, much lower altitude. So notice I didn't say anything about where on the map that is. I described here some sort of abiotic condition. Altitude. So I'm describing with adjectives what the place that they live in is like, not where it is on a map. And that's the difference. The other thing that we should mention, actually let's go back. Something then that I would ask you to do on your own is to think of an organism that you know about and try to describe first its habitat and then its range. So what kind of conditions does it live in? And then where does it live if we're talking about a map? Now lastly, if we're talking about where organisms live, we can be specific maybe to one more degree. And we can talk about the word niche. Species can share habitat and range if their niche, if their role is different. So two organisms might have the exact same habitat and the exact same range, but because they perform different roles in their environment, they can coexist without being a limiting factor on each other. So, in this picture, I have this bird here. It's a kingfisher. Down here, I have another bird. It is a heron. Now these two birds live in the same spot, same habitat, but they have different niches. One of them hunts during the day, and the other one hunts at night. That means that they are not competing with each other directly for food sources. They're hunting at different times, so different organisms are active during the day and at night. Now here's another species, a human. We are pretty general. We can sort of get by on a lot of different things. And so we don't interfere with those birds necessarily because we do not need to consume the same type of food that they're consuming. We have a lot of choices. Over here, we have a sea cow. It is very specialized. It requires really warm water and eats only this kind of seagrass. And it only gives birth to a few offspring. It's a pretty specific organism. And so its niche is quite tight. You might remember learning in grade 9 about a narrow niche and a broad niche. Humans have a broad niche. It means that we can do lots of things, but probably are not particularly skilled at any one of them. Whereas things that have a narrow niche are usually quite specific, but perhaps incredibly skilled at the one thing that they do.